Hello, I am Steve Ullman, native of Mankato, Minnesota, and author of the book Blood on the Prairie, a novel of the Sioux Uprising. But for the next few minutes, I will be Toby Riker, Chief Scout for the 6th Minnesota Regiment under Colonel Henry Hastings Sibley, telling you the story of the Great Sioux Massacre. The year is 1862. The Civil War is going full swing in the South. Minnesota achieved statehood just 4 years ago, and homesteaders are moving in. But on the reservations, the Sioux Indians are angered by their poverty-stricken lives, by the false promises of their government treaties, and by the continual influx of homesteaders onto their lands. And their hostility is making the white settlers very nervous. This is how it all happened, and the tragic consequences for both white and Indian alike. One cannot help but be impressed with the beauty of the colorful Minnesota prairie during the summer and autumn months. When Joseph Nicolet, a French explorer, came through this area in the 1830s, he said, "There is something magical about the prairies, the fresh breeze that springs up, the sweet grass everywhere, the blue of the sky, all combine to free one's spirit." Traverse des Sioux, which in French means crossing place of the Sioux, was an ancient fording place on the Minnesota River, a heavily traveled trail from St. Paul and Fort Snelling to the upper Minnesota and Red River valleys. On June 30th, 1851, Governor Alexander Ramsey, Commissioner of Indian Affairs Luke Lee, Delegate to Congress Henry Sibley, and other government officials came to this sweet land and established a camp near the old French cemetery on a height overlooking the small trading post and mission on the riverbank. They gathered to negotiate an important treaty with representatives of the Sisseton and Wahpeton Sioux for almost 24 million acres, called the Sioux Land. This vast tract comprised most of Minnesota, west of the Mississippi River and south of a line between present-day St. Cloud and Moorhead, as well as portions of South Dakota and Iowa. News of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux on July 23, 1851, started a great land rush that brought swarms of settlers to the fertile lands acquired by the United States from the Sioux Indians. The treaty was not negotiated in good faith on the part of the government. Payments to the Sioux were late in coming. There was much corruption and stealing of Indian money by the traders, and food and supplies were delivered only sporadically. When the starving Sioux begged Andrew Myrick, a trader at Traverse des Sioux, for food, he told them to eat grass. The outbreak of the Civil War made the treaty even less of a priority with the government. By now, the Sioux were starving infected with the diseases of the white man and drunk on the trader's whiskey, and several of them had died. Both Southern Confederate sympathizers of the Civil War and representatives of the British government approached the Sioux with guns and supplies and asked them to start a rebellion in Minnesota, which would distract the Union Army from the battles of the Civil War. Coming from warrior stock, desperate, and now perceiving the homesteaders and the traders at Traverse des Sioux as their enemy, the Sioux felt they had no choice but to go to war against the settlers. Acton, a small community in western Minnesota, was the site of the first attack by Sioux against the whites. On August 17th, a small group of Sioux shot and killed a few homesteaders, then fled to their home camps and confessed to the tribal elder what they did. The warrior leaders, upon hearing this, gathered and took the oath of war against the settlers. On August 18th and 19th, they led a massacre across Minnesota's western frontier that killed or wounded nearly 1,000 settlers. Chief Little Crow, assisted by Big Eagle, Cut Nose, and other warriors, led the Sioux in battle. Trader Merrick was one of the first to be massacred, and his mouth was stuffed with grass. They then attacked New Ulm and looted and burned the town and killed several more settlers. When word of the massacre reached St. Paul, Governor Alexander Ramsey approached Henry Sibley, a former fur trader with knowledge of Indian ways and one of the principal negotiators of the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, and convinced him to lead the Indian Expedition, as it was called. He was given the rank of colonel and placed in charge of the 6th Minnesota Regiment at Fort Snelling. As soon as he had enough soldiers and supplies, Sibley marched from Fort Snelling upriver to St. Peter, where he set up a bivouac site. From there, he proceeded to Fort Ridgely, which was under attack by Little Crow, and where he set up his field command post. Fort Ridgely was upriver from New Ulm and was one of 3 federal forts in Minnesota and the closest one to Little Crow's warriors, who continued to terrorize the settlers on the prairie. Sibley arrived there with his troops on August 26th after the soldiers there had held off 2 attacks from Little Crow. Fort Ridgely had cannon and howitzers. Fort Ridgely had cannon and howitzers that produced vastly superior firepower to any weapons possessed by the Sioux. This firepower changed the rules of war on the prairie and tipped the scales in favor of the soldiers, just as it did in the battles that followed. Battle of Birch Coulee, September 2nd and 3rd, 1862. Sibley quickly organized a burial detail under the command of Major Joseph Brown to search the area for survivors of the massacre and to bury the dead settlers whose bodies were still strewn about the prairie. Little Crow and his warriors spotted the burial detail while they were en route to Mankato and St. Peter to loot them the same way they had done at New Ulm. The Battle of Birch Coulee was thus underway. It lasted for over 30 hours. Sibley heard gunfire echoing up the Minnesota River Valley and marched to the relief of the burial detail with his cannon. Only then were the Indians forced to retreat. There were heavy casualties on both sides. Historians tell us that Little Crow won the Battle of Birch Coulee.